If you're reading this, it means the world I knew no longer exists. That's how it began, with a single envelope hidden in the dust of a forgotten attic, sealed since 1973. Inside was a letter from someone who had already seen our future and feared it. What followed was not just a story, but a chain of events stretching across decades. Red rain falling from a silent sky, strangers who knew my name before we'd ever met, a love that could cross time itself, and a choice that could decide whether the world survives or burns. This is not a tale you can walk away from halfway. Once you open the letter, there is no going back. If you're reading this, it means the world I knew no longer exists. That was the first line. 7 words, written in ink that had faded to the color of old smoke, on paper so brittle I was afraid it would dissolve in my hands. But before those words ever reached my eyes, there was the attic. I had not intended to go there. The farmhouse itself had been abandoned for at least 40 years, a crooked thing standing alone in the moors of northern England, its stone walls still holding back the wind but not the cold. I had come to photograph the ruin for a history project, nothing more. The front door was already sagging off its hinges, and when I stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp timber and something else, something older, like the breath of a sealed crypt. Every step creaked as though I was walking on a sleeping beast. The kitchen was nothing but dust and cobwebs. The sitting room had a fireplace blackened by decades of silence. And then I found the narrow staircase, tucked behind a warped wooden door. It was barely wide enough for one person, and the steps felt uncertain beneath my weight. At the top was the attic. A single small window let in a beam of weak afternoon light, cutting through the dust like a blade through fog. The place was filled with forgotten things. A child's wooden toy horse with one wheel missing, a trunk with travel stickers from cities I had never visited, a stack of yellowed newspapers bound with string. And then, tucked between 2 sagging boxes of books, I saw the envelope. It was unlike anything else in that room. Perfectly placed. Dust had settled on it, yes, but it was untouched by moisture, untouched by the years. The paper was thick, almost velvety under my fingertips, and the handwriting, elegant, deliberate, as though each letter had been carved instead of written. Across the front were the words, "To be opened in the year 2050. I almost laughed then. It was 2050 now. And here I was, standing in a forgotten attic, holding something that had waited for exactly this year to be found. But it was the initials at the bottom corner that gave me pause. No full name, no address. Just 2 letters that meant nothing to me, yet felt like they should. There was a wax seal on the back, deep crimson, stamped with an insignia I didn't recognize. A circle with 3 lines crossing through it. My heart was beating faster now, and the silence in that attic seemed to grow heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I considered leaving it unopened. After all, it wasn't mine. Maybe some historian or archivist should be the one to read it. But something in me, some quiet, stubborn part, refused to walk away. When I broke the seal, the sound was sharp in the stillness, like the snapping of a twig in a forest where you know you're not alone. I unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to tear it. And there it was, the first line. If you're reading this, it means the world I knew no longer exists. The voice in those words was not a stranger's. It was intimate, speaking as though to a trusted friend. The handwriting wavered in places, as though the writer's hand had trembled. I read on. My name is not important. By the time you read this, it will be a name no one remembers. What matters is what I must tell you, what I could not stop, though I tried. I am writing from the year 1973. The world then was not yet the place you now stand in. We believed in our future, in the promise of it. But something happened. Something that changed the path we were on. And if you have this letter, it means that change was not enough. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. 1973, that was nearly 80 years ago. The world then, oil lamps in some houses still, no internet, no space tourism. And yet the voice on the page seemed to know my world, or at least what would happen to it. The letter went on to describe a day in early spring when the writer first realized something was wrong. Not a single event, but a pattern. Small reports in newspapers, strange shifts in weather, animals behaving as though they sensed an unseen predator. I kept my observations to myself at first, the writer continued, thinking I was imagining it. But then came the night I could not ignore, when the air itself seemed to shudder, and the stars moved in ways no star should move. I knew then that it had begun, and yet I could do nothing. For every person I tried to warn, there was another who called me mad. I was left with only one choice, to write this, in the hope that you might be able to finish what I could not. I had to stop reading. My pulse was racing. I looked around the attic, suddenly convinced that someone, or something, was watching. But the only sound was the faint wind outside, rattling against the loose tiles. I read on, my eyes devouring every word. The writer described in unsettling detail a series of echoes, moments where the present seemed to fold back on itself. A street they had walked countless times, suddenly lined with buildings they didn't recognize. A clock that skipped forward several hours in the blink of an eye. And always, the same 3 words whispered in their dreams, "It will fall." The letter grew more urgent then. I do not know if you have seen it yet. Perhaps in your time, it has already happened. Perhaps it is still coming. But I will tell you this, I saw it once, a flash of what is to come. A city, I do not know which, crumbling into dust as though struck by some invisible force. People running without knowing where to run to. And above it all, a sound like the tearing of the sky itself. I felt my stomach twist. It didn't feel like fiction. It didn't feel like the ramblings of a lonely person in 1973. It felt like a warning. Then came the line that froze me in place. I could not prevent it. I tried, but I failed. And yet, perhaps you still can. The words seemed to echo in the attic, though I knew I was reading in silence. The letter didn't explain what I was supposed to do. Not yet. It simply told me that there were clues hidden, not in the letter itself, but in the place where I had found it. If you are reading this in the farmhouse, the writer continued, then you are closer than you know. Look beneath the floorboards near the window. There is something there, something that does not belong in your time. Guard it. Protect it. For it may be the only key left. I looked at the floor by the narrow window. The boards were warped and uneven. Something in my chest tightened, part fear, part the thrill of discovery. But the letter wasn't finished. The final paragraph was stranger still. Do not trust them. They will come to you smiling with answers that feel like truth. But they do not serve the truth. They serve the circle. And once you step inside it, there is no way out. Remember my initials. You will hear them again. And that was it. No signature. No date beyond the year. Just those 2 letters, etched at the bottom like the last breath of a dying voice. I stood there for a long time, staring at the paper. Outside, the sky had darkened to a stormy gray, and the wind was rising. I felt the weight of the letter in my hand, not just its physical weight, but the weight of everything it implied. I knew I should leave. I knew that whatever was under those floorboards might be nothing at all, a rusted tin, a forgotten trinket. But something in me, something I couldn't name, told me that if I walked away now, I would regret it for the rest of my life. The boards near the window came up easier than I expected. Beneath them was a narrow cavity, and in it, a box. Small, made of some dark metal that felt cold even in the warm air of the attic. There was no keyhole, no latch, no obvious way to open it. And yet, as I lifted it out, I felt the faintest vibration in my hands, like the heartbeat of some sleeping creature. I looked back at the letter, at the line that still burned in my mind. Perhaps you still can. The wind rattled the window then, and for a moment I thought I heard something else beneath it, a whisper, low and close, though I was alone. It said 3 words, the same 3 words the writer had heard in their dreams. It will fall. And in that instant I knew this was only the beginning. You must understand the world as I knew it, for only then can you grasp the weight of what I have seen. The year was 1973, and on the surface, everything seemed alive with promise. We were told we were standing at the threshold of a bright new age. Men had already walked on the moon, cities were rising taller than they had any right to, and the hum of modernity was in the air. People spoke of the future as though it were a certainty, something shining and golden, just waiting for us to arrive. Yet beneath all that optimism, I felt the undercurrent. You may not believe me, but there is a way the world feels when something is wrong. The air tastes different. The shadows fall at stranger angles. Even in laughter, there is a note of fear no one dares to name. I carried that knowledge like a stone in my pocket, always there, always heavy. It began with the dreams. At first, they were only fragments. A flash of fire in the sky, so bright it burned my vision even after waking. A roar of water swallowing streets, sweeping cars away like toys. Faces, hundreds of faces, all unknown to me, yet I woke with the certainty that I had met each one in some impossible place. They stared at me from the darkness of my mind, their eyes wide with something between terror and accusation. I told no one at first. Dreams are just dreams, aren't they? Or so I tried to tell myself. But the dreams began to bleed into the day. I would be walking to the market, and for the briefest moment, the blue sky above would be painted in shades of orange and crimson, a silent firestorm overhead. Or I would be speaking with a friend and find that I could no longer hear their voice, only the rushing sound of waves, far too close, far too loud. And always, there was the feeling that the faces were following me. Not in the streets, not in the waking world, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when my thoughts drifted. It was as though they were waiting for me to understand something urgent, something I had somehow forgotten. I began keeping a journal, desperate to trap the images before they slipped away. The more I wrote, the stranger it became. I would wake to find entire pages filled with my handwriting, describing events I did not remember dreaming. Sometimes the dates were years in the future. Sometimes they were marked with nothing but a word: fall. By late summer, the dreams had grown so vivid they left me shaking for hours afterward. One in particular stayed with me. It was the first to come complete, with no gaps, no blurred edges. I stood in a city I didn't know, its streets glistening with rain though no clouds hung above. People hurried past me, their coats whipping in a strange wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Then the sound began, a low, rising hum that made the air vibrate. Heads turned upward. That was when the fire came. It did not fall like a bomb. It blossomed, silent at first, then with a noise that tore through me, a noise that was not sound alone but something felt in the bones. Glass shattered, buildings swayed, and then, as quickly as it had begun, the fire was gone, leaving only the cries of those who had been caught in its wake. I woke gasping, the smell of smoke still thick in my nostrils. You might think this was nothing more than the result of an overworked mind, a trick of the imagination. I thought so too until one morning in October. I was reading the paper in a small cafe when I saw the headline, "Ocean liner destroyed in freak fire at port, hundreds feared dead." The photograph stopped my breath. The ship's deck was split open, steel bent back like petals on a burning flower. The sky above was lit with the same unnatural hue I had seen in my dream. It was not just the image. It was the details, the rain on the streets in the photograph, the shape of the dockside buildings, the position of the onlookers. I had seen all of it before, exactly as it happened. I knew then that these dreams were not dreams at all. They were glimpses. I did not know whether they came from the future or from some darker place, but I could no longer dismiss them. And with that realization came the fear that had been lurking all along. The fear that perhaps I was not meant to see these things, and that someone, somewhere, would make sure I did not see them again. From that day, the world around me seemed sharper, more dangerous. I noticed people I had never seen before, lingering too long in doorways, watching me in the reflection of shop windows. Strangers would pass me in the street and murmur words I couldn't catch, their eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat before they slipped away. I tried to confide in one person, an old friend named Samuel, who had always been more open-minded than most. We met in the park, the leaves curling brown beneath our feet. I told him about the dreams, about the fire at the port. At first, he listened in silence, his hands clasped tightly. But when I finished, he shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't speak of these things," he said. "Not to me. Not to anyone. There are people who listen. People who do not take kindly to interference. Interference with what? I asked, but Samuel only looked away, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the trees. He stood abruptly, muttering that he had to go, and left without another word. I never saw him again. The dreams grew worse after that. I stopped sleeping for more than an hour at a time, afraid of what I might see. My hands began to shake during the day. I felt like a thread pulled too tight, ready to snap. Then, one night in December, I had the dream that ended any hope of denying what was happening to me. It was snowing, heavy and wet, the kind that sticks to your coat and soaks you through. I stood on a bridge over a river, its dark water churning with debris. Downstream, a small town clung to the riverbanks, its streets lined with glowing windows. And then, from somewhere far away, came a sound like a sigh, deep, low, and impossibly vast. The river swelled. It rose with unnatural speed, breaking over its banks, smashing into houses. I could hear the cries of the people trapped inside. The water was not just water, it was black, choked with ash and broken things. I saw a woman clutching a child, swept away before I could move. The bridge beneath me began to tremble. When I woke, my pillow was wet with tears, my chest aching as though I had been running for hours. I knew, with the same certainty I knew my own name, that this was not some distant vision. It was soon, very soon. 3 days later, I read the news. A dam had burst in the north after a sudden surge of meltwater, flooding a town almost exactly as I had seen it. Entire families had been lost. The bridge, the same bridge, had been found in pieces miles downstream. And the numbers of the dead matched the number I had scrawled in my journal after waking. It was then that I realized I had crossed a line from which I could never return. These were not warnings meant for me alone. They were pieces of something larger, something I did not yet understand. And now, it was no longer just the dreams I had to fear. For the morning after the flood, I found a note slipped under my door. No signature, no greeting. Just 3 words written in neat, unshakable ink. "We are watching." That was when I began to prepare. There are nights that vanish from memory as if they never happened, and there are nights that remain lodged in your bones forever, as sharp and unyielding as broken glass. The night I am about to tell you about was the latter. It began quietly, almost tenderly, with a wind that carried the scent of rain. The streets of my small town in 1973 were empty, lit only by the warm yellow glow of old street lamps. Shops had closed early, as they often did when the air felt heavy like this, and the sound of my footsteps echoed against brick walls slick with evening mist. I had been restless that week. The dreams were growing stronger, closer to my waking life, and the note, "We are watching," still sat in the pocket of my coat. I found myself scanning faces in crowds, searching for the watchers Samuel had warned me about. But on that night, the streets seemed empty of life entirely, as though the town had already gone to sleep. The first drop fell on my cheek. Warm, too warm to be ordinary rain. I stopped, touching it with my fingertips, expecting to see the clear shimmer of water. Instead, it was red. Not a faint red that could be explained away as dust in the wind or some strange trick of light. This was the color of blood, thick, deep, and glistening in the dim lamplight. I looked upward. The clouds above were swollen and strange, not gray but a dark, bruised crimson, pulsing faintly as if lit from within. And then the sky opened. The rain poured down in sheets, warm and viscous, coating the streets, the shop fronts, the roofs. I stepped back under an awning, but the droplets still reached me, staining the cuffs of my shirt, running in narrow rivulets across my hands. The smell was faint but metallic, and though I would later tell myself it was impossible, it smelled exactly as real blood smells when fresh. I wasn't alone for long. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. People stepped out, staring up at the sky with expressions that shifted from awe to terror in moments. No one spoke at first. We were all waiting for someone else to explain it. Then the murmurs began. Questions, prayers, curses. A man I vaguely knew from the post office ran into the street, hands raised, letting the red rain soak his skin. He laughed at first, a high, sharp sound, but it turned into a scream that froze my blood. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as if something had burrowed inside. Others rushed to help him, but when they touched him, they too began to scream. I took a step back, heart hammering. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rain stopped. The clouds above dissolved, leaving behind a perfectly clear night sky littered with stars. But the stains remained, on the pavement, on walls, on clothing. They would not wash away. By morning, officials had arrived. Men in plain suits, their cars unmarked, though they moved with the authority of those used to being obeyed. They told us it was nothing more than a weather anomaly, dust carried in from the Sahara mixed with rainfall. It had happened before, they said, and would happen again. But their eyes told a different story. They were alert, scanning us as if measuring who had seen too much, who had been touched by it. When I asked one of them whether dust could explain the warmth, the smell, the way the stains refused to fade, he simply stared at me for a moment too long and said, "Best not to dwell on such things, sir." I noticed, too, that the man from the post office was gone. His house stood empty, curtains drawn. Someone said he'd been taken to hospital, but no one could say which one. Others who had touched the rain directly vanished as well, leaving behind only whispers. That was the first time I heard the phrase "the watchers" spoken aloud. It came from an elderly woman who ran the bakery. She said it quietly, almost to herself, as she scrubbed at the stains on her windows. "They've marked us," she murmured. "The watchers always mark their own." When I asked her what she meant, she shook her head and pretended not to hear me. I began to see them more often after that, always on the periphery, on street corners, in cafes, in the reflections of shop windows. Men and women who seemed utterly ordinary until you looked at them too long, and then something shifted. Their eyes held a stillness that did not belong to any human gaze I had known. I tried to ignore them, but ignoring the watchers is like ignoring a shadow that moves when you are still. You can pretend not to see it, but you always feel it just behind you. And yet, the red rain was not the most haunting part of that night. That would come later. It was a week after the rain when she vanished. Lillian. She had been my one anchor through the growing madness of that year. I met her in the early summer of '73, and from the beginning, she seemed to carry the weight of knowing more than she ever said. There was a light in her that felt older than her years, and sometimes, when she looked at me, I had the unshakable sense that she could see the dreams inside my head without my telling her a word. The night before she disappeared, she came to my flat. Her coat was damp from the mist, and her eyes were sharper than I had ever seen them. She didn't sit down. She didn't remove her coat. "It's begun," she said. I asked her what she meant, and she told me I didn't have time to ask questions. She pressed something into my hand, a small brass key, ornate and cold. "Keep it hidden. If they find it, it's over." I demanded to know who they were, but she was already walking toward the door. "Lillian, wait." She turned back, her face pale but steady. "You'll know soon enough. Just remember, don't follow the circle." I didn't sleep that night. The key sat on my desk, catching the light from the street lamp outside. I kept expecting her to come back, to explain, to tell me what in God's name was happening. But she didn't. And in the morning, she was gone. The police took my statement, but their questions felt hollow, their eyes distracted. Days passed, and there was no trace of her. Friends spoke of her in past tense. Strangers stopped making eye contact with me altogether. And then the watchers became more brazen. One of them, a tall man in a gray coat, stood outside my window for 3 nights in a row, never speaking, never moving, just watching. When I finally opened the window to shout at him, he smiled once, slowly, and walked away into the fog. That was when I understood that the red rain, the watchers, and Lillian's disappearance were threads in the same web. I could not yet see the shape of it, but I knew it had been spun long before I stumbled into it. And so I write these words with the weight of that night still pressing on me. It began the day she disappeared. Her name was Lillian. Even now, after all these years, I cannot speak it without feeling the echo of her presence in the room, as if by saying it aloud, I might summon her back. She was not the kind of beauty you notice across a crowded room. She was the kind you feel before you ever turn to look. There was an energy to her, a light that didn't come from the sun but from someplace far older, far deeper. We met on an afternoon that should have been unremarkable. The year was still young, the air in early spring cool enough to keep the streets quiet. I had ducked into a second-hand bookshop to escape a sudden drizzle. The shop was a cramped warren of shelves that smelled of paper and dust. And there she was, standing in the narrow aisle between history and philosophy, her fingers brushing the spines as though she could read the stories through her skin. She looked up when I stepped past her, and her eyes caught mine. They were not just blue or green, they were both, shifting with the light, holding the kind of gaze that makes you feel you've been caught doing something you shouldn't. She smiled faintly, almost as if she recognized me. "You're looking for something you haven't found yet?" she said, as though it were not a question but a fact. I laughed awkwardly and admitted I didn't know what I was looking for. "Then you'll find it," she replied, turning back to the shelves. "That's how these things work." We spoke little else that day. But when I left, she followed a few moments later, and by some silent agreement we walked together under the awnings, talking about nothing and everything. By the time the rain stopped, I realized I didn't even know her last name, but I knew I would see her again. And I did. Over and over. Sometimes by accident, sometimes because I had quietly arranged my life to pass by the places I knew she favored. The bookshop, the park with the leaning oak tree, the cafe where she always chose the corner table. Our romance unfolded in fragments, like pieces of an old film reel discovered in the wrong order. Laughter in autumn fields where the air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke. Her head resting against my shoulder during late-night walks when the streets were empty and the city seemed to belong only to us. Evenings by candlelight when the electricity failed, her face glowing in the flicker, her voice low as she spoke of impossible futures as if she had lived them. There was always something in the way she spoke, not just the words, but the certainty behind them. She would describe a place she had never visited in the present tense, as though she had walked its streets only yesterday. Sometimes she would look at me with a kind of sorrow in her eyes, as though she saw the end of something before it had even begun. I asked her once how she knew so much about places and times she had never seen. She smiled a little sadly. "Maybe I have seen them," she said. "Maybe not here, not now, but somewhere. Somewhen." At first, I took it as poetic whimsy, part of her charm. But as the months passed, I began to suspect she meant it exactly as she said it. And when the red rain fell, and the watchers began appearing in the edges of my days, I thought of her words with a chill. She never seemed surprised when I told her about my dreams, the visions of fire and water and faces I didn't know. Instead, she listened quietly, asking questions that were too precise to be casual. Did the faces ever speak? Did I smell anything in the dream? Did the air feel heavy or light? Her questions made me uneasy because she was not trying to comfort me. She was trying to understand. It was during those nights, the ones where we spoke little, where she watched the candlelight instead of me, that I began to fear losing her. Not because of some quarrel or the slow fade of affection, but because I sensed she was not entirely mine to keep. She was tethered to something beyond me, something that might call her away. And then one night it did. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones no matter how many blankets you pile on. I had been half dozing in my chair when I heard the knock. Not the hurried, polite tap of a neighbor, but 3 deliberate knocks spaced evenly apart. When I opened the door, Lillian stood there, her coat buttoned high, her hair damp from the mist. She didn't greet me. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the shadows behind me before she stepped inside. She kept her coat on, pacing once across the room before stopping in front of me. "It's begun," she said. I asked her what she meant, and she shook her head. "There isn't time for me to explain. You just have to trust me." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass key. It was ornate, old-fashioned, and warm to the touch, as though it had been in her hand for a long time. She closed my fingers around it, holding my hand tightly. "You have to hide this. No one can know you have it. Not the police, not your friends, no one. If they find it, it's over." "Who?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Who are you talking about?" "The Watchers." Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she said, "Don't follow the circle. Whatever they offer you, whatever they say they can do for you, don't let them draw you in. I wanted to grab her, to keep her there until she told me everything, but she was already stepping back toward the door. Lillian. She turned one last time, and her expression softened, just for a heartbeat. Hide it until 2050. And then she was gone. I ran to the window in time to see her cross the street, disappearing into the fog. I wanted to follow, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the certainty that if I followed, I wouldn't come back. That was the last time I saw her. The next day, her flat was empty. Her phone disconnected. No one had seen her, or if they had, they wouldn't say. The watchers became bolder after that, their eyes following me with open interest, as if they knew she had given me something. And so I kept the key hidden, just as she asked. But I have carried the weight of it every day since, not just in my pocket, but in my mind. I do not know what it unlocks. I do not know why it had to wait until 2050. But I do know this: Lillian was not a woman who spoke without reason. And if she asked me to keep it safe until now, it is because she believed that you, whoever you are, would be the one to use it. The key has never left me. It is the one tangible thing I have left of Lillian, the last fragment of her life before she vanished into the fog. And yet, it has never felt like a keepsake. It is a presence, an unanswered question in the palm of my hand. When she first pressed it into my fingers that night, I thought it was simply an antique. Small, brass, weighty despite its size. But when I turned it over in the light, I saw it was no ordinary key. Its bow, the looped end, was formed in the shape of an unbroken circle, though not perfectly round. 3 faint grooves cut through it, intersecting at the center like compass points. The shaft was engraved with markings I didn't recognize. Not letters, not numbers, symbols. Some were sharp and angular, others curved in ways that felt almost biological, like the spirals of shells or the curling of vines. The strangest thing was the temperature. That first night, the key was cold, so cold it made my skin ache, though it had been in her hand for minutes before she gave it to me. I remember rubbing it between my palms to warm it, but the chill lingered, as if it were made of something that did not belong to our world. In the days after she disappeared, I took it to 2 locksmiths. The first examined it for less than a minute before handing it back with a shrug. "Custom work," he said. "No idea what it's for. Could be decorative." The second was more thorough, turning it under his magnifying glass, tracing the symbols with a gloved finger. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "A friend," I lied. He didn't smile. "Not British," he murmured. "Not European either." I'd say, "Nowhere I know." I asked if he could make a copy. He shook his head. "It wouldn't work, even if I could. Keys have to match locks. And this," he tapped it gently, "this was made for a lock that doesn't exist." That night, I decided it had to be hidden. If the watchers were looking for it, as Lillian had warned, it couldn't stay on me. I searched my flat for the right place, somewhere both obscure and personal. My eyes landed on a wooden music box I had owned since childhood. My father had given it to me when I was 9, a small, rectangular case with a faded inlay on the lid and a winding key underneath. It played a simple waltz when opened, the sound tinny but oddly comforting. The inside was lined with dark velvet, and there was a false bottom I had discovered years before. It was shallow, meant for hiding coins or letters, but it would do. I wrapped the key in a scrap of cloth, placed it inside, and replaced the panel. I wound the music box once, listening to its familiar tune as if sealing the secret inside the notes. For years, that is where it stayed. I moved flats twice during that time, and each time I made sure the music box came with me, carefully packed among my most valuable possessions. Sometimes I would take it out, wind it, and watch the tiny brass cylinder turn. But I never touched the key. I couldn't explain why, but I felt that taking it out without reason might set something in motion I wasn't ready to face. And then one night, the box played by itself. It was winter. I had been asleep for hours, the kind of heavy sleep that comes from exhaustion rather than rest. The wind outside rattled the windows, but it wasn't the wind that woke me. It was the sound, faint at first, then unmistakable, of the waltz. The same uneven, mechanical melody drifting from across the room. I sat up, my breath visible in the cold air, and turned on the lamp. The music box was on the shelf where I always kept it. The lid was open. The cylinder was turning. I hadn't wound it in weeks. I got out of bed slowly, every step making the floorboards groan. My mind was already searching for explanations, a mechanical fault, a trick of the cold, but none of them explained why the lid was open. I reached out and stopped the cylinder with my fingers. The room fell silent. And then, from inside the box, I heard a sound I had never heard before. Not music. A faint metallic click, like something shifting beneath the false bottom. My pulse quickened. I lifted out the panel, expecting to see the cloth-wrapped key. But the cloth was gone. The key was there, still cold, still marked with its strange symbols, but it was lying atop something else. A photograph. It was creased as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. The edges were yellowed, the surface scratched. I picked it up carefully, afraid it might crumble. And then I saw the image. It was me. Not as I was in 1973, but older. Decades older. My hair was thinner, my face lined, my eyes carrying the weight of years I hadn't yet lived. I was standing in the middle of a ruined city street. The buildings around me were shattered, their skeletal frames leaning at impossible angles. The sky was a sickly, dust-filled gray. And in my hands, in the photograph, I was holding the very letter I am writing to you now. I felt the air leave my lungs. My knees almost gave way. I turned the photo over. There was handwriting on the back, not mine. Slanted, delicate, achingly familiar. It's not too late. Lillian's handwriting. I stared at those words until they blurred. How could this photograph exist? I had never stood in that place, never worn those clothes, never been that old. And yet there I was, undeniable, captured on paper that looked as though it had endured half a lifetime. A dozen questions pressed in on me, but one stood above them all. Was this my future? Was the photograph a warning or a promise? I sat at my desk for hours that night, the key in one hand, the photograph in the other. I traced the symbols on the key with my thumb, wondering if they were coordinates, dates, some kind of code. I thought about the watchers, about their still, inhuman patience. Had they known this would happen? Had they been waiting for me to find it? And most painfully, I thought about Lillian. Had she known this photograph would one day be mine? Had she seen it as she had seen so many things before they happened? By dawn, I realized there was one thing I could no longer deny. The key and the photograph were connected, and both were connected to me in ways I could not yet understand. The city in the image, the ruins, the sky, was not any place I knew, but something about it told me I would one day stand there. Whether by choice or by fate, I would hold this letter in my hands and face whatever had torn that city apart. The question was not whether I would go there. The question was whether I would survive it. I could not look away from it. The photograph lay on my desk, its surface worn by years I had not yet lived, its corners bent like the edges of old memories. I had lit a single lamp, the rest of the room sunk in darkness, so that all my attention was on that image, and on the impossible truth it seemed to hold. It was me. There was no mistaking the shape of my face, the curve of my jaw, the small scar above my eyebrow. But the man in the photograph was older. Not a little older, Sveits. His hair had thinned and paled to silver. His eyes had the weary depth of someone who had seen too much and survived too little. His shoulders were slightly stooped, and yet there was a strange steadiness in his stance, as if he had learned the hard way not to bow to the weight of the world. But it wasn't just my older self that chilled me, it was the place around him. The city in the photograph was nothing I recognized from 1973. The skyline was jagged with the skeletal remains of towers made entirely of glass and steel, many broken open as if by giant hands, their interiors exposed to the sky. The streets were not paved but buried under drifts of pale sand, as though the desert had claimed the heart of a metropolis. Street lamps stood tilted at odd angles, their bulbs dark, and overhead, the sky was a heavy, dust-choked gray, as if the sun itself had been dimmed. In my older self's hands was a folded piece of paper. Even in the grainy quality of the image, I knew exactly what it was. The letter I am writing to you now. How could this be? How could there exist a photograph of me decades from now, in a place that might not even exist yet, holding a letter I had not yet finished writing? I turned the photograph over, my hands trembling despite myself. The back was as worn as the front, but the words were clear, written in slanted, unmistakable handwriting. "It's not too late. Lillian." It was her hand, her letters. I knew them as surely as I knew my own. The pressure of her pen was there, the faint hesitation in the upward stroke of the T, the delicate curl of the L. She had written it for me, or for the man I would become. I sat there for hours, the photograph before me, my thoughts chasing themselves in frantic circles. There were only a handful of explanations, none of them comforting. 1. This was some kind of elaborate forgery designed to frighten me, to manipulate me. If so, it was almost flawlessly executed. The image was too precise, the details too personal. 2. The photograph was real, which would mean that somehow, somewhere, I would live to see this city, to stand among its ruins, to hold this very letter in my hands. Which would mean the future was not only visible to someone, but fixed enough for them to capture it on film. 3. The photograph was not of the future, but of another place entirely, a place where my life had already unfolded differently. The third thought chilled me more than the others, because if such a place existed, then Lillian might have come from there. Her strange knowledge, her certainty when speaking of events that had not yet happened, her warnings about the circle, about the watchers, all of it began to fit together in a way that was more frightening than comforting. I thought of the night she gave me the key, the way her hand had lingered over mine, the unspoken goodbye in her eyes. I wondered if she had already known that this photograph would one day find me, if she had known where it would lead. For the first time in years, I took the key from the music box and held it in the same hand as the photograph. The brass felt even colder than I remembered, almost biting against my skin. The symbols etched into its shaft seemed to shimmer faintly in the lamplight, though I told myself it was only my eyes playing tricks. Could it be that the key and the photograph were parts of the same puzzle? Was the locket opened in that ruined city? Or, more terrifying still, could the key unlock the way to that city itself? The watchers came back into my thoughts then. I realized I had not seen them in several weeks. It occurred to me that perhaps they had been waiting for me to find this photograph. That night I dreamed of the city. It was not like my other dreams, fragmented and half-formed. This one was sharp, unyielding in its detail. I stood in the middle of the sand-swallowed street from the photograph, the wind carrying the fine grit against my skin. The towers rose above me like broken teeth. Somewhere far off, something was groaning, not a creature, but a structure straining under its own weight. In my dream, I looked down at my hands and saw the letter. I unfolded it. The words inside were mine, but not the ones I'm writing now. They were a plea, a warning. And then the wind rose, tearing the paper from my hands, scattering it into the air. That's when I saw her. Lillian stood at the far end of the street, her coat whipping around her in the wind. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her face was the same light in her eyes, the same calm in the storm. She didn't move toward me, didn't call out. She simply raised her hand, pointing to something behind me. When I turned, I woke. I rose from bed before the sun, unable to shake the dream. The photograph lay on my desk where I had left it, unchanged, but it felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight not only of its own impossible existence, but of the path it was pushing me toward. And through it all, one thought burned in my mind. If Lillian was right, if it truly was not too late, then whatever this was leading to had not yet happened, which meant it could still be changed. But changed into what? It was the kind of night London wears, like an old overcoat, damp, heavy, and smelling faintly of coal and rain. The fog clung to every surface, swallowing street lamps until they glowed like dull embers in the mist. I had been walking for over an hour, trying to clear my thoughts after another day spent staring at the photograph, the key, and the letter that now seemed less like something I had written and more like something that had been given to me. I remember passing the empty newsstand on the corner of Fleet Street, its metal shutters streaked with condensation. My breath clouded the air as I crossed into a narrower lane, one of those streets where the old stones still remember the weight of centuries. It was silent there, except for the sound of my shoes on wet pavement. And then, from the fog ahead, he stepped into view. He was tall, his posture straight in a way that made him seem anchored to something deeper than the ground beneath him. His gray coat was buttoned to the collar, the fabric so clean and sharp it seemed untouched by the damp air. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his eyes, when they found mine, cut through the fog as though it wasn't there at all. He stopped directly in my path, close enough that I could smell something faint and metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. And then he spoke. Elias Harding. The sound of my full name froze me in place. I had not spoken it aloud to anyone in months. Even fewer knew my middle name, yet he had said it as though we were old acquaintances. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice unsteady. "Do I know you?" His mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've been holding something that doesn't belong to you, and writing something that must not be destroyed." The fog pressed closer, as if it too wanted to hear what came next. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as if measuring the truth in my eyes. "You've already seen the photograph," he said, "and the key. You've seen enough to know the circle exists. What you do not know is that it must be preserved." The word circle struck me like a chord struck on a piano. Lillian had spoken it in warning. "Don't follow the circle," she had said. Now here was this stranger, speaking as though it was something sacred. "I don't understand," I said. "What is the circle?" His gaze sharpened, and I realized he had no intention of explaining it. "Your understanding is not required," he said. "Your compliance is." My hand instinctively brushed the inside pocket of my coat, where the letter was folded. His eyes flicked down, and for a brief, chilling moment, I knew he could see it there, as if the paper was glowing through the fabric. "You must never destroy it," he said quietly, his voice now carrying an edge like a blade. "If the letter falls, so does the circle. And if the circle falls, so does the rest." A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I forced myself to hold his gaze. "Who are you?" For the first time, his expression changed. There was something in his eyes that was neither kindness nor cruelty, only an impossible depth, like staring down into a well with no bottom. "I am someone who has stood where you will stand," he said, "and someone who will stand where you are standing now. That is all you need to know." My mind reeled at the impossibility of it. "Are you saying you've been in that city? The one in the photograph?" Instead of answering, he reached into his coat and drew out a folded sheet of paper. The edges were frayed, the creases deep, as though it had been opened and closed many times. He held it out, and when I didn't take it immediately, he stepped closer until the distance between us was only inches. His eyes locked on mine, and in a low voice that felt like it was being spoken inside my own head, he said, "Do not look for her. Do not try to change what must come. All that matters now is that you carry the letter to where it belongs." I took the paper from him without meaning to. It was heavier than it should have been, as though the map it contained, for that's what I knew it must be, carried more than just ink on its surface. "What is this?" I asked. "A path," he said simply. "One you will follow whether you choose to or not." I wanted to ask him about Lillian, about what had happened to her, about whether she had been part of this circle he spoke of. But before I could, something changed in the air. The fog thickened suddenly, not drifting as fog does but folding inward, closing around him like a curtain. My eyes stung and I blinked, once, twice, and when I opened them again, he was gone. There was no sound of footsteps, no shadow retreating into the mist. One moment he was there, and the next the street was empty, leaving only the damp stones beneath my feet and the folded map in my hand. I stood there for a long time, the cold settling into my bones, the words preserved the circle echoing in my mind. And then, slowly, I unfolded the map. What I saw inside made my hands tighten involuntarily. It was not a map of any London street, nor any city I knew. It was a patchwork of places and times, each marked not just with a name but with a date. Some were years I had already lived through. Others were decades ahead. The ink was dark and precise, the handwriting as deliberate as the stranger's voice. But it was the final marking that stopped my breath. 2050, last light. And under those words, in smaller letters, something else. She will be there. The paper was soft from age, yet the ink was sharp and deliberate, each line drawn with the precision of someone who had committed this map to memory long before they ever put pen to paper. I stood in that fog-stilled street, my breath curling in the air, and felt the weight of it in my hands. It was not a map of any London I knew, nor any city I had ever seen. At first glance, it looked like an incomplete puzzle, fragments of landscapes connected by twisting, unnatural routes. Some areas were sketched in fine detail, jagged coastlines, rivers snaking through valleys, while others were left blank, as if the cartographer had chosen not to record what lay there. And then there were the names. Some were familiar, cities I could place on any globe, towns I'd read about in the news. Others were places that simply didn't exist. Names that felt real in my mouth but rang hollow in the world I knew. Bastion Reach, Gallowfen, The Divide. I ran my fingers over each one, hoping some trace of them would surface in my memory, but they were as alien to me as the face of a stranger. It was the dates that unsettled me most. Next to each location, written in the same hand, was a year. Some were in my past, 1964, 1970, 1972, but most lay ahead of me like milestones on a road I didn't know I was walking. 1999, 2027, 2048. The numbers seemed to hum with significance, though I could not yet say why. Certain places bore no year at all, only a single word: fall. I stared at those locations for a long time. The word could mean many things: the season, the act of descent, the collapse of something great. It was impossible to tell which meaning was intended. Yet each fall seemed to be placed with intent, scattered like black marks on the spine of history. Were these disasters waiting to happen? Or meetings that would change everything? Were they warnings or invitations? The longer I looked, the less I felt like the map was a thing I was holding, and more like it was a thing holding me. The connections between places felt alive, almost breathing beneath the paper. The roads and rivers seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them, as though the map was adjusting itself to my gaze. And then my eyes fell to the bottom corner. The last entry, 2050, last light. The words sat alone, set apart from the rest of the markings. No coordinates, no path leading in or out. Just that date and that name. Beneath it, written in smaller script, almost as if it had been added later: she will be there. My chest tightened. Lillian. There was no name, but I didn't need one. Every part of me recognized the truth in those words. The stranger in the gray coat had not spoken her name, but he had led me to this. She will be there. For a long time, I simply stood in the lamplight, the cold gnawing at my bones, the city's silence pressing in. My thoughts were a tangle of longing, fear, and something darker, the knowledge that if I went to her, it might not be a reunion. It might be an ending. And yet, what choice did I have? The dates on the map began to replay themselves in my mind. 1999, 2027, 2048. They weren't just points on a page, they were stepping stones across the river of my life. If the stranger was right, if this was a path I would follow whether I wished it or not, then each of these years would bring me closer to that final mark, last light. The name itself was a riddle. Was it a place, a time, an event? Was it the end of something, or the last hope before the dark? I turned the map over, hoping for notes, instructions, anything that might explain its purpose. The back was blank, save for a faint indentation, the ghost of a circle drawn in haste. 3 lines cut through it, meeting in the middle. The same symbol pressed into the wax seal of the letter I had first found. The circle again. Always the circle. I remembered Lillian's voice as clearly as if she stood beside me. Don't follow the circle. And yet the man in the gray coat had told me the circle must be preserved. Their warnings pulled at me from opposite ends, and I stood between them, holding the one object that might connect them both. The fog was thinning now, the wet cobblestones reflecting the weak light of the street lamps. I folded the map carefully and slipped it into my coat. but the cold weight of it pressed against my ribs like a promise I could not break. As I began to walk, I realized that nothing in my life had felt like mine since the moment I met Lillian. Every step since then had been towards something I could not name, a thread pulled by unseen hands. And now, with the map in my possession, the pull had grown stronger. I thought of the photograph of my older self standing in the ruined city, the letter in my hands. I thought of the sand-choked streets, the broken towers, the sunless sky. And I thought of the words on the back, written in Lillian's hand, "It's not too late." But what if it was? What if every date on that map was already set in stone? What if last light wasn't salvation at all, but the final flicker before the dark swallowed everything? I stopped walking. The city was utterly still, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. Somewhere far away, a bell tolled the hour. I looked up at the sky, blank and pale above the fog, and whispered to no one, "Lillian, what have you led me to?" And though there was no answer, I felt it then, the faintest vibration against my chest, as though the map itself had heard me and was waiting for my next move. The first time the map proved itself, it was the year 1999. By then, I had been living with its weight for over 2 decades. It had traveled with me through the slow march of years, folded away but never far from reach, like an unspent bullet in the chamber. I told myself I was keeping it for curiosity's sake, for the unanswered questions, but in truth, I was afraid to let it go. I had studied it so often that I could see its lines when I closed my eyes. I knew every curve of every strange coastline, every misplaced river, every name that belonged to no map in the known world. And I knew the dates. I carried them in my head as one might carry the birthdays of children, though each felt more like a silent countdown. When the calendar turned to 1999, one date in particular began to hum in my mind like a struck tuning fork. Next to it, a name, Dresswick. There was no Dresswick on any atlas. I had searched them all. Yet I found it in reality one gray afternoon in late February, a small town folded into the hills of the north, the kind of place that looks as if it has been asleep for 100 years. It had a single main street lined with weathered shops, a post office, and a church with a spire that had long since surrendered its cross to rust. The people moved slowly, bundled against the wind, their eyes flicking towards strangers but never lingering. On the edge of town stood a dam, a broad, curving wall of concrete, holding back the weight of a dark reservoir. The locals spoke of it with casual pride. It had been there for as long as they could remember, a silent guardian keeping the valley below safe and fertile. The map gave no month, no day, only the year. But the word beside Dresswick was not a date at all. It was fall. It was late autumn when the air changed. You can feel such shifts in your bones if you've lived long enough. The way the wind carries a different voice, the way the ground seems to hold its breath. The week before the tragedy, rain had been constant, thickening the river that fed the reservoir until the water lapped high against the dam's lip. The sound of it was a restless growl that carried even into the streets. I was in a boarding house at the edge of town when it happened. The night was ink-dark, the rain relentless. Around midnight, there was a sound like nothing I had heard before, a deep, muffled crack, as though the earth itself had broken. Then came the roar. It was the sound of a giant exhaling after holding its breath for a century. Water surged forward, black and unbroken, sweeping away everything in its path. I saw houses lifted from their foundations like toys, their lights blinking once before vanishing into the flood. Trees bent and splintered. The church spire tilted and fell, vanishing in the churn. I remember the faces most. People standing in the doorways of the boarding house, frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Some ran into the street, calling out names swallowed instantly by the roar. Others dropped to their knees where they stood. It lasted only minutes, but it was enough. By morning, the valley was a scar, the water already retreating as if ashamed of what it had done. The streets were strewn with debris, timber, clothing, pieces of furniture. In the silence after, the only sound was the faint clatter of something metallic rolling against the stones. They said hundreds were gone. Entire families. Entire histories erased in the space of a night. I stood on what was left of the main street, my shoes sinking into the thick mud, and thought of the map. of the word written beside this place. For I did not know whether the map had shown me the future, or whether the future had been shaped because the map existed. But the line between the two felt thinner than paper. That night, in my small rented room, I unfolded the map again. My fingers traced the dates still to come, 2027, 2048, each one suddenly heavier now that I knew they were not idle marks. My eyes drifted to the final entry, 2050, last light. Beneath it, the smaller script I knew as Lillian's hand. She will be there. The dam's collapse had been devastating, but it was not personal. It was a tragedy witnessed, not one aimed at me. Yet as I sat there in the dim light, I felt a shift, a certainty that the closer I came to that final mark on the map, the less I would be only a witness. Because if the map was right, if it had always been right, then I was not moving towards some distant event. I was being pulled into it. And I must tell you this, because you must understand the danger in these words. If you've reached this part of my letter, you're already in danger. It began so subtly that I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening. At first, it was just the creak of a floorboard in the next room late at night. A faint draft where there should have been none. The soft click of the latch on the front door as if it had shifted under its own weight. London winters are cruel to old houses, and I told myself that was all it was, the groan of settling wood, the sigh of pipes. But the truth was, deep down, I knew better. Because the timing was wrong. The sounds didn't happen when the wind was high, or when the temperature dropped sharply. They happened when I was thinking about the map. They happened when I unfolded it on my desk, or when I stared too long at the brass key in my palm. And then the voices started. Not shouts or conversations, nothing that obvious. Just whispers. Low, urgent murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls, indistinct and yet somehow aimed at me. They never rose above that hushed level, never resolved into words I could fully understand. But there was one constant in them, my name. The first night I heard it clearly, I was lying in bed, half between waking and sleep. The room was cold, and the street lamp outside painted pale gold bars across the ceiling. And then, from the far corner of the room, a whisper, not from the window, not from the door, but from the air itself. Elias! I sat up so fast my vision swam. The corner was empty. The air hung still. But my pulse didn't slow for hours. From that night on, the activity grew bolder. Footsteps in the hall when I was alone. A shadow passing across the light under the door. The faint clink of glass in the kitchen when no one had touched it. The worst came one night in March. I had fallen asleep at my desk, the letter half written before me. The sound woke me, the sharp, mechanical rhythm of a typewriter. My head snapped up, and for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks. I hadn't owned a typewriter in years. But the sound was real. It was coming from the corner of the room where the old cabinet stood. And as I stared, the sound continued, click, 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 followed by the metallic snap of the carriage return. I rose slowly, my breath shallow. The air was heavy, tinged with the faint scent of oil and ink ribbon. When I reached the cabinet, the sound stopped. The room fell silent. I opened the cabinet door. Inside was nothing but papers and a few books. But on the very top, resting where no one could have placed it without my knowing, was a single sheet of paper. On it, typed neatly in black letters, "Don't destroy it." I didn't need to ask what it was. The map. The letter. It was then I realized that these things I had kept all these years, these objects that tied me to Lillian and to the stranger in the gray coat, were not just relics of the past. They were being guarded. Not by me, but by something else. And it was clear now that this something was not going to let me remove them from the path they were meant to take. The first time I tried to burn the map, the lights went out. Not in the whole house, just in the room where I sat, the flame of the candle guttering to nothing though there was no draft. I relit it twice, each time watching it sputter and die before I could touch the paper to it. On the third attempt, I felt it, the faint pressure of fingers against my wrist. They were cold. The second time, I tried to drop the key into the Thames. It was a bright morning, the water brown and restless beneath the bridge. I stood there with my hand over the rail, my fingers opening, and then, as if gripped by some unseen force, they closed again. My arm locked in place. No matter how I tried, I could not let go. Only when I stepped back from the edge did the feeling release me. By then, I was beginning to understand. This wasn't protection in the kind sense of the word. It was control. The same unseen hands that had steered me toward the attic, toward the letter, toward the map, they were steering me still. One night, in a rare moment of defiance, I decided I would tear the letter in half. It was almost finished then, only a page or two left to write. I thought if I destroyed it before I completed it, perhaps I could break the thread that seemed to be pulling me forward. I took it in my hands and began to pull. The whisper came instantly, not from the walls this time, but from directly behind me. A voice close enough that I felt the warmth of breath against my ear. Elias, no. The paper slipped from my fingers. My skin was clammy, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision pulse. I turned slowly. The room was empty. And yet, in that emptiness, I felt a presence so tangible it was as though someone stood between me and the door. After that, I didn't try again. Not because I had accepted my role in whatever this was, but because I realized something else. The letter wasn't finished because they didn't want it finished yet. I could write only what came to me in moments, as if the words were being fed through my hand rather than formed in my mind. There were days when I sat for hours, pen poised, unable to write a single word. And then, without warning, a rush, the sentences tumbling out as though someone else were guiding them. It was during one of these bursts of writing that I made a discovery that chilled me more than the voices or the footsteps or the invisible hands. I had reached the end of a page and turned to write the next, only to find it missing. The stack of paper was otherwise untouched, but the final sheet was gone. I searched the desk, the floor, the drawers, every room in the house. It was nowhere, and I knew I had not removed it myself. Someone had taken it, which meant the letter, as it existed in this moment, was incomplete. But somewhere, the missing page already existed, and someone else had it. The missing page haunted me. I could live with the whispers. I could endure the footsteps at midnight and the strange cold that clung to the corners of my house. I could even tolerate the unseen hands that stopped me from burning the key or the map. But the absence of that page, the deliberate theft of it, was a wound that never closed. Because whoever took it didn't just steal paper. They stole a piece of the truth. It happened in the winter of 1979. I had been living quietly, or as quietly as one can when life itself feels like a tightrope over a chasm. London was drowning in gray that year, the streets slick with rain, the city's heartbeat muffled by the constant drizzle. I was sitting at my desk in the early hours, the coal fire burning low, working on what I thought was a private piece of writing, my letter. I remember the night in fragments, the steady scratch of the pen, the dim lamplight on the desk, the quiet creak of the floorboards above, which I told myself was only the house settling. And then so the knock. 3 raps. Not hurried, not hesitant. Measured. When I opened the door, he was standing there. Wrapped in a dark coat that seemed to drink the lamplight instead of reflecting it. His face was pale, sharp-boned, with eyes so dark they might have been black. But it was his voice that unsettled me most, low, steady, and carrying a weight that made each word feel like it had already been spoken many times before. Elias Harding, he said. Not a question. I should have asked who he was. I should have demanded it. Instead, I stood there, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other tightening instinctively over the pocket where the letter rested. I've come for the page, he said. What page? I asked, but my voice lacked conviction. The last one you wrote tonight, he replied without hesitation. The one you don't yet understand. If it remains with you, history will repeat itself. I told him he was mad. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. But he only stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was nearly a whisper. I am from 2050, Elias. I have seen the ruins. I have seen you there. And I have seen what happens when the page stays in your possession. My chest felt tight. You expect me to believe you're from the future? He tilted his head, studying me as if measuring my worth. Believe what you want. But understand this, that page contains the choice. If it remains here, you will make the wrong one. And the world will burn again. His words sent a chill through me deeper than any London winter. The fire cracked in the hearth, but it felt suddenly far away. "What choice?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he extended a gloved hand. "Give me the page, and I will place it where it needs to be. Not for you to read now. Not for anyone in this time. It was never meant for here." I hesitated, torn between suspicion and the deep, gnawing knowledge that somehow, impossibly, he might be telling the truth. "How do I know you are who you say you are?" He leaned closer. "Because I can tell you what you've dreamed." And then he did. He described the city in the photograph with the precision of someone who had stood in its shadow. He described the fire in the sky, the water-swallowing streets, the faces I could never forget. He even knew about Lillian, not just her name, but the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the brass key she pressed into my hand. My defenses crumbled. Without a word, I went to my desk, took the final page from the stack, and handed it to him. He slid it inside his coat as if it were nothing more than a receipt. "You'll see it again," he said, "but only when it's time." I tried to ask what was written on it that mattered so much, but he only gave a faint, unreadable smile. Some things must be unknown to be fulfilled. And then, as if the world itself had exhaled, the lamp flickered, and he was gone. Not down the street, not into the fog. Gone as though he had never stood there at all. For years after, I regretted giving it to him. Every time I read the letter back, my eyes snagged on the abrupt ending, the absence that felt like a missing limb. The words stopped, but the meaning did not. The silence after was deafening. In time, I stopped asking myself what was on the page. I started asking why it was never meant for everyone to read. And now, as I write the rest of this letter, I must tell you, I got it back. Not from him. Not by chance. But because I hid it, in a place neither he nor the watchers could reach, a place where only the right hands would ever find it. You may wonder how I could both give it away and hide it. The truth is, that night in 1979, I gave him something else. A decoy. The real page I had already placed where it belonged. And if you've read this far, you may be closer to it than you think. But it is not for everyone. And if you are not meant to have it, you will never find it. The attic was exactly as I had left it. Dust lay thick on the beams, the air stale with decades of stillness. The single window, smudged by time, allowed only a dim gray light to seep through, painting the room in a color between memory and forgetting. It had been years since I'd climbed those creaking stairs, years since my fingers last trailed over the forgotten relics that lived up here. The rusted trunk, the stacks of yellowed newspapers, the small wooden chair missing a leg. And yet, the moment I stepped into that space, I felt the pull. The same pull I had felt the day I first broke the seal on the letter. I knew why I was here. The letter's final passages had been read. The map lay folded in my coat. The key, still cold to the touch after all these years, rested in my pocket. And now, the only thing left was the missing page, the truth I had hidden away in a place only I could find. I moved toward the far wall, where the boards were warped with age. Beneath the window, half obscured by a moth-eaten blanket, sat the old music box. Its once polished surface had dulled to a deep, lifeless brown, and the inlay on the lid was barely visible under the grime. I knelt beside it, brushing away the dust with the sleeve of my coat. The hinges groaned softly as I opened the lid, revealing the familiar dark velvet lining. The winding key was still in place. For a moment, my hand hovered over it, but I resisted. This wasn't the time to hear its tune. Not yet. Instead, I slid my fingers beneath the lining and pressed against the false bottom. It gave with a soft click. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment, empty, except for a folded sheet of paper. The missing page. My throat tightened as I lifted it free. The paper was yellowed, its edges soft from age, but the handwriting was still sharp, each stroke purposeful. And as I read the first line, I felt the years between then and now collapse into nothing. It was her hand. Lillian's. If you hold the key, you hold the choice. I read it again, slower this time, as though the meaning might change under my gaze. In 2050, choose love or the world burns. The words were simple, but they struck me harder than any vision, any whispered warning, any prophecy etched into the map. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't an instruction manual for saving the world. It was a plea, and it carried the weight of someone who had seen the end with her own eyes. I sat there in the dim light, the key cold against my palm, and felt the enormity of it settle over me. Choose love. The simplicity of the phrase was deceptive. Love for what? For whom? The person? Humanity? The world itself? Could such a thing truly tip the balance between survival and ruin? And if so, why me? Why had I been given the key? Why had I been entrusted with the letter? I thought of all the paths that had led me here. The attic in 1973, the red rain, the watchers in the fog, the stranger in the gray coat, the impossible photograph. I thought of the dam's collapse in 1999, the date still looming ahead on the map, and the final mark, 2050, last light. She will be there. I closed my eyes and tried to picture her. Not the younger Lillian I had loved, but the one I might see in that ruined city, older, changed by the years and by whatever journey she had taken. Would she recognize me? Would she still trust me to make the choice she had asked for? And then another thought crept in, colder than the air around me. What if the message was not a promise, but a trap? What if the choice was never mine to begin with? What if all of this, the letter, the key, the map, had been nothing more than the circle ensuring I walked the path they wanted, until I stood exactly where they needed me to stand? The boards under my feet groaned as if in answer, and I realized I had been sitting too long. I folded the page carefully, sliding it into the inside pocket of my coat with the other pieces of the puzzle. I closed the false bottom of the music box and lowered the velvet lining back into place. And then, almost without thinking, I turned the winding key. The first notes were soft, hesitant, as though the instrument were waking from a long sleep. Then the melody came, tinny but steady, filling the small attic with its fragile song. I hadn't heard it in years, but the sound carried me instantly back to the moment Lillian's hand closed over mine, pressing the brass key into my palm. The tune wound on, each note stretching into the next, until the last one lingered in the air like a question. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. A faint click. The lid of the music box shifted slightly, though I hadn't touched it. And from somewhere deep within the house, or perhaps from nowhere at all, a whisper. My name. I rose slowly, the hair on my arms lifting as the air grew colder. The light from the window dimmed, though the clouds outside had not moved. The key felt heavier in my pocket. Was it a warning? A prophecy? Or a trap? I don't know. What I do know is that if this letter has reached you, then the moment has come. The map's final mark is no longer in the future. Last light is now. And the choice, whatever it truly is, will be yours to make. So if you find yourself standing where I stood, holding what I hold, remember her words. Choose love, or the world burns. The music box played again as I turned to leave the attic, though I had not wound it. The music box falls silent now, but its echo lingers, the way some stories refuse to end, even after the last word is read. Somewhere, in some time, the key waits. The choice waits. Perhaps in the next letter, perhaps in a place none of us can see yet, the answers will come, or the questions will only grow deeper. If this journey has stirred something in you, if you felt the cold weight of the key in your own hand, if you've wondered what you would do standing at the edge of last light, then don't let the story end here. There are more forgotten attics to open, more sealed envelopes waiting for the right hands, more voices across time whispering warnings, confessions, and truths too fragile to be spoken aloud. Join me in finding them. Keep this fire lit so it can guide us to the next discovery. Like this story if it held you until the final moment. Share it with someone who would understand its weight. Leave your thoughts, your theories, your choices in the comments. I read everyone. And if you have not yet done so, subscribe so you'll be here when the next letter is found. The key may one day be yours. And when it is, you'll want to be ready.